Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. Talks scheduled in Doha between the Taliban and Afghan representatives today have been postponed after a disagreement over who should attend. Sultan Barakat, director of Qatar's Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies, the organization sponsoring the talks, tweeted, "This is unfortunately necessary to further build consensus as to who should participate in the conference. The talks were billed as a significant first step towards finding a negotiated end to the war and the eventual withdrawal of US troops, which would end America's longest war." A list of 243 people was announced by Qatar on Thursday. That list differed from Afghan President Ashraf Ghani's list of 250 delegates, which included around 50 women. Earlier on Wednesday, Taliban spokesperson Zabiullah Mujahid had questioned the size of the government delegation, saying it was not normal and they had no plans to meet with such a large delegation. Efforts to find an end to the war in Afghanistan have picked up pace since the appointment in September 2018 of US peace envoy Zalmay Khalilzad, who has held several rounds of talks with the Taliban. Khalilzad tweeted that he was disappointed Qatar's Intra-Afghan initiative has been delayed. "We are in touch with all parties and encouraged that everyone remains committed to dialogue. I urge all sides to seize the moment and put things back on track by agreeing to a participant list that speaks for all Afghans." The Taliban had previously refused to hold direct talks with Ghani's government, calling them puppets of the United States. However, after pressure from Khalilzad and the government of Qatar, where the religious movement maintains a political office, they agreed to an intra-Afghan dialogue that includes members of the government who were to participate in their personal capacity. The US has been holding separate bilateral peace negotiations with the Taliban in Doha as part of a months-long peace push led by Washington. The developments come as fresh violence rips across Afghanistan, with the Taliban launching their so-called spring offensive. The Taliban now control, influence, or contest about half the country. To discuss what comes next, we have with us Ms. Zakia Wardak, who joins us from Kabul, Tanya Goudsouzian, who's a political analyst based in Istanbul, and we shall shortly also be joined by Rahimullah Yusufzai, who is the resident editor of the news based in Peshawar. Let me begin with you, Ms. Wardak. You wrote an op-ed in one of the US publications in which you said that you're a woman and yet you are in favor of talking to the Taliban. Now, that's a very interesting thing, and I believe you said this because there has been a lot of concern about as far as the women and minority rights are concerned in relation to any kind of Taliban participation or when they were ruling 95% of the territory in Afghanistan. So can you give me a sense of what exactly is your view in relation to talking to the Taliban and the fact that this particular intra-Afghan dialogue has been postponed?
I believe that, they should have not making an excuse of this large the list that we have sent it to the Qatar. Actually, it is unfortunate to see for a meeting of 20 representatives of Afghan Taliban. Our political leaders in the government find it very necessary to send it such a huge number to Qatar, which was not necessary. But see the way they are making excuses, it seems that they are not ready to sit down to talk about peace.
So do you really think the deal breaker here for this particular conference was the number of women that were going to be part of the delegation? 50 women, that's a pretty large number as far as the Taliban are concerned, in the sense that when they were ruling 95% of the territory in Afghanistan back in the 90s, they weren't particularly good with women. Do you think over the years some of that hardline might have changed, but still not enough?
Well, actually, my perspective that we should have sent it an equal or not more than 30 or 40 representative from Afghanistan, and equal numbers should have been women, and professional women in the different fields, like IT, engineering, medicines, teaching, law, or religious scholars. Men should be the same way, and also should be very well prepared for a very proper debate. But why I wanted to say that the professional women should have gone or should go to this peace process or to these dialogues, because Taliban wants to recognize that today's women, there is a change in today's women. They are more advanced. They are leading family. They are leaders. So they have to recognize that women are not the women they were in the late 90s or early 20s.
Okay, so you're saying that Taliban should recognize this. However, since they are dialoguing from a position of strength, they also have a certain kind of ideology. Perhaps that ideology is being diluted a little, but it's very much there. So therefore, if I were to go back to the op-ed that you wrote, which I talked about, where you said that you're a woman and yet you agree that there should be a dialogue with the Taliban, is this a hope that you cherish, that they will come around, or is there some solid evidence that you have? Because, I ask this question because the general perception about talking to the Taliban among the liberal sections of Afghan population, especially women, is that they need to be fought against. If they come into the mainstream, Afghanistan will be thrown back to the 90s.
That's why I have recommended that the professional women in different fields should go, that the Taliban should recognize the positive advance of women. So that's why, even in my article, I wrote down that the people of Afghanistan should sit together and find out what kind of problems they have and what kind of solution they are looking for. And as a woman, today, I want the Taliban to realize that women, that they are leaders. Today we have leaders, women in the government. We have a professional women. We have women as entrepreneurs. So they are not these women that were ruling in the 90s or early 20s. So they should see the changes. Also, I believe they're ready, because this time they had some representatives from the Taliban side, the women representative from the Taliban side, which is they wanted the Afghan women talk with them.
Okay, so there's also a degree of conservatism in the Afghan society, even in the urban centers. I'm not just talking about the countryside, which obviously is far more conservative. But for instance, in 2015, there was a very tragic episode of a woman who was lynched by the mob in Kabul. And this is the time when Kabul was not ruled by the Taliban. So perhaps one could say that the Taliban are the more extreme end of the kind of conservatism, societal conservatism, that we still see even in the urban centers?
So what are you expecting from a country which has been in the war for past 40 years? People are traumatized. People are wearing jeans, but they don't know the meaning of how to respect a woman or what is the rule of the woman and the society. So all these people, they have grown up in the war. So when the people are growing up in the war, when they don't have a proper job, when they don't have a proper education, that's what happened. What is it? They go into extremism. But we were saying that, the Afghan Taliban are more than welcome, and we are very ready to welcome them. But they have to realize that today's women are not the women they were used to be. We have ministers, we have deputy ministers, we have entrepreneurs, we have an artist, we have a woman who's making film, we have a woman who is in the street and selling clothes or selling some groceries. So these women, why? Because who is affected by the war? The past 40 years, when the insurgency happens, a woman loses her husband, a woman loses a father. There's a woman who loses a son, or somebody who's a breadwinner, who's bringing the bread to the table. So woman gets hurt. Women are when you do not have anyone in your life to bring food to your table. So what the woman should go out. If the Taliban prohibited women from work, so there is two things. Even they will have to send their children to beg, or their children as young children, instead of going to school to get an education, to work. So they have to realize that we are moving forward, Afghanistan moving forward, and they should move forward with us.
Okay, stay with me. Tanya, move forward. Now, here's the thing. As far as the United States is concerned, it came into Afghanistan primarily because it thought that there was a terror attack planned from the Afghan soil. At that particular moment, the idea was not to come in and actually try and modernize the Afghan society, but ultimately that became an agenda of sorts. And then, yes, there was, stepping back from that also. And now, of course, the talks are all about somehow getting out, somehow getting the Taliban in, and trying to also retain the political configuration that came into being after the US offensive. But at the societal level, at the human level, there are concerns, exactly these concerns about the minorities and the women. Do you think that, these concerns obviously are very important, but do you think the US at this particular point in time is really concerned about that?
Well, I would like to bring attention to an article that was published not too long ago by the wife of the Special Envoy, the US Special Envoy, Zalmay Khalilzad. It was a piece about Afghan women, and the gist of it appeared to be, or it was interpreted by many to be, well, Afghan women aren't really our problem anymore. After so many years, we've done enough, and that's it. That article was followed by so much outrage across the board. Afghan women reacted really badly to that. And I think, so to pick up on what Ms. Wardak was saying, let's not diminish the achievement of Afghan women who put a great deal of pressure on both sides and managed to get themselves represented in the delegation, in the Afghan delegation that was meant to arrive in Doha, and also on the Taliban side. So that was done not by intervention from outside, but that was very much a show that Afghan women were not really going to allow themselves to be sacrificed on the altar of political expediency for a peace agreement to be reached with the Taliban, so that the Americans could go back and say, aha, we've done it, we've made peace and the war is over. I'm not really sure, I'm not convinced that the Americans are concerned about the state of Afghan society once they pull out.
Now, that's a very important point you're making, and that's also a point that concerns primarily those in Kabul and outside Kabul that are criticizing the peace process. And you've been on my programs, we've discussed it before also, in the way that the urban society and also the Kabul government are watching from the sidelines this process. But at the same time, Zalmay has been able to get the Taliban to agree to an intra-Afghan dialogue. Now, do you think that this particular postponement is more a hiccup and that, in the near future, they will come round to some kind of common ground, some kind of understanding of what kind of delegation they want from Kabul that they will sit across from and can talk to?
Well, let's be frank. The optics were pretty bad on both sides. The Taliban had made it clear from the outset, as soon as the list was announced, the 250-member list was announced, saying this is not a wedding party, this is a peace conference. Correct. Or an it's a dialogue. Yeah. On the other side, however, there is a feeling, and this is based on my conversations with individuals in Kabul, both related to the government or close to the government, there is a feeling that whatever the Afghan government at this point does, the efforts are going to be subverted by the Taliban on one pretext or another. So here, on the one hand, we're hearing the Afghan that the Taliban is disputing the number of participants sent from Afghanistan. On the other side, we're hearing another narrative saying, well, actually, this is the Taliban refusing to sit down with certain individuals who were part of that list, individuals that they don't want to talk to, that they find objectionable for whatever reason because of opposition that they voiced to.
Absolutely, including, for instance, there was the name of Amrullah Saleh in the list. And Amrullah Saleh has been on record as saying that, and you know, he's also opposed to the dialogue process to begin with. The number of tweets, direct and indirect, some of his tweets addressed Zalmay Khalilzad directly. He has also been, when he was the NDS chief, obviously he was operating against the Taliban. The Taliban accused him of having captured and tortured and killed their cadres. So yes, I agree with you. That's also my understanding and what my sources said from Kabul, that there were certain individuals in the delegation that the Taliban were really opposed to sitting across from.
I believe the major issue, I cannot speak for Amrullah Saleh, but what I can say is one of the major issues voiced both by him and, several members of the Afghan government is that they have been marginalized by this process for months. Since it began, they've been left out, they've been marginalized, and this has fueled perceptions that there is an active attempt to delegitimize the Afghan government. So you can't really blame them for expressing frustration and anger over the way the process was perceived to be conducted.
Okay, Tanya, stay with me. I'm also joined by Rahimullah Yusufzai. Rahimullah Yusufzai, what is your sense of why the intra-Afghan dialogue has been postponed? Is it because of the high number of people on the list? Is it because the Kabul list contained 50 women? Or is it because the Taliban objected to some specific people in the list? I named one, but there are others also. What are your sources saying?
Publicly, Taliban are saying that there are too many people and you cannot have a serious discussion with so many people around. This is what they said, and you mentioned that. But I think there are other reasons also. When they agreed to talk to the Afghan opposition leaders in Moscow in February, there were about 38 Afghans who came from Kabul, and Taliban met them, and they even were able to issue a joint statement which carried most of the Taliban demands, like withdrawal of the foreign forces and removal of Taliban names from the UN Security Council blacklist, all these things. So I think, it's not that Taliban are refusing to talk to Afghans, because they have given a word and they said they can meet Afghans even if they are part of the government, but they have to come in their individual capacity. But I think that, even some of the people who were on the list, like you mentioned, Amrullah Saleh and some others, they have, voluntarily withdrawn from this visit to Qatar, because they say that there should be direct talks between Taliban and the Afghan government. And Taliban keeps saying that this is not direct negotiation. This is a conference where everybody can express his or her views. They met two Afghan women, delegates in Moscow, Fawzia Kufi and Hawa Nuristani. So if they have met two, they will, I think, be willing to meet more. That should not be a hurdle. I think the real reason is that the list is very large. So you cannot have a realistic and focused discussion. Secondly, I think they still do not want to interact with the Afghan government. So maybe that is also an issue, that there are many who will be representing the Afghan government in this meeting. And I think eventually this meeting will take place because, Taliban cannot go back on their promise.
Okay, so this is interesting. You're saying that this is, the real reason is that it was a very long list, and the Taliban thought that they could not have a focused discussion. So what is your sense? And in the Moscow round, there were about 38 people from Afghanistan. So what is your sense? What would be the acceptable number to the Taliban of the intra-Afghan dialogue?
In Moscow, where we heard that there were more than 50 people eventually. Some were the local Afghans living in Russia, and they were the organizers, although Russia was behind the whole exercise. There were about 10 to 12, I think, Taliban. So, that was about 50 people or a bit more. Maybe they will be willing to meet, maybe a bit more. I don't know, because maybe now the Afghan government will also be sending its representatives. And people who were earlier reluctant to travel to Moscow, they will also like to come along. So there could be 70, 80 people, that will be more realistic. But I heard that, Hamid Karzai was preparing one list of people whom he knew or who served with him. The Afghan government was preparing another list, which was Ashraf Ghani's, side.
Yeah.
Dr. Abdullah was preparing his own list. There were also people from civil society. There were so many people who wanted to come along.
Qatar had prepared its own list, which had 243 people. The
Yes.
Ashraf Ghani list had 250 people, including 50 women. Now you're telling me that Abdullah was also preparing some kind of list. I wasn't aware of that. So how about the Afghans sit down and actually prepare one list rather than having so many lists?
This was the idea. Zalmay Khalilzad was asking the Afghans to offer sacrifices for peace. He wanted a joint national delegation of all the anti-Taliban forces to go to Qatar and meet Taliban. He wanted an intra-Afghan dialogue, an Afghan peace process led and owned by the Afghan people rather than by outsiders. That was a good idea, I think. This is a very good opportunity. It should not be wasted.
Okay.
And that's why I think both sides should be pushed to meet and talk. Whenever people meet, many misconceptions are overcome. You can make progress. Could you imagine that these 38 Afghans, Ahmed Karzai and Muhammad Mohaqiq and Yunus Qanuni and Hanif Atmar and many others, who had been involved in fighting with Taliban, and they were, refusing to talk to each other. Imagine they getting together under one roof in Moscow and then also being able to come up with a joint statement. That was, I think, a foreign policy, success for Russia as well. Because the real thing is to have an intra-Afghan dialogue. The Americans and Taliban can talk about the withdrawal of forces and security issues, but the Afghans have to resolve all the issues concerning any amendments in the constitution, release of prisoners who are being held by the Afghan government or Taliban. So they have to do most of the work.
So Rahimullah Yusufzai, you talked about one of the main reasons being that the list was very large. So there was also the Moscow round, and there were about, as you said, about 50 people there. Were all of them able to put in their word during the Moscow round?
No, I think many of them were not able to talk. The former Afghan ambassador to Pakistan, Dr. Hazrat Omar Zakhilwal, has written in one of his articles that he could not speak. There were many others. This happens in conferences, and if you take 250 people, I think, maybe more than 200 will not be able to speak. So this is, you actually select a representative of every ethnic group, every party, every group, and he or she speaks for the other. This is how things happen.
Okay.
So I think they have to be more organized and more realistic.
Okay.
It's not that you are neglecting or ignoring somebody, but you are not taking so many people from one group or one party.
Okay. I'm also joined by Masood Azizi, former Deputy Minister of Interior. Mr. Azizi, very quickly, tell me, what is your sense about the postponement of the intra-Afghan dialogue? And I was just talking to Rahimullah Yusufzai, and you might have heard him say that he's confident that this is just a postponement and the Taliban will sit across from the Afghan delegation very soon. But why do you think this postponement happened? Is it because the number of delegates was very, very large, or do you think there was some other reason?
I do believe that this is not the done business. We do have, this is an opportunity that we all realize that we need to come, and the only solution for a prosperous and stable Afghanistan is the dialogue and come up with a political settlement. So normally such a process takes time. You know, it's not overnight or a quick win. So we were expecting delay. There will be more delay in the future. But I think the patriot Afghans, they're all realizing that this is the important process, and we need to come up with a resolution for ending this long-term conflict in Afghanistan. Coming to the second point, what you ask is, what can be the reason? Well, the rumors are correct, I believe, that one is specific about the delegate list of the Taliban commented, actually, that this is more of a delegation going to a ceremony of wedding rather for a conference. But from the Afghan perspective, Afghanistan is a consist of different ethnicities and tribes and different political opinions. I think it's very important that we should make this more inclusive rather exclusive process.
So what do you think would be an acceptable number to the Taliban? Before you joined, we were talking about the Moscow round, and we kind of calculated that including the Afghans living in Moscow, the delegation was about 50 people. There were about 8 to 10 Taliban. So do you think about 70 to 80 or 100 people delegation would be acceptable to the Taliban?
I think we should never come up with exact number. If you look at it from the Afghan government perspective, they were very clear on their message that this is more of a conference, which is the same type of conference like in Moscow, where they can come with their own statement. It is not a negotiation, which probably for negotiation settlement, the Afghan government was very clear that we will come up with a separate delegation when the Taliban is ready to make this intra-Afghan delegation, process to make the negotiation.
Absolutely.
But I think we should not come with the exact number. If we make these obstacles, these are small things. I think we should not say that this number should be participating, not that number.
Okay,
so
Mr. Azizi, I'm sorry, I only have this much time for this discussion. Thank you so much for your insights. Very quickly, back to Ms. Wardak, since I have to wrap up. Ms. Wardak, are you also optimistic that since the Taliban have given their word, they will get back to the table?
Well, we are hoping that they all get back to the table, because this is the only way we can bring peace to dialogues. And also, we should not bring the participation of women less than a man. I always believe that equal, if the 30 man goes, 15 should be women and 15 should be men. And regarding when I'm hearing from other people, and I think the 50 or maximum of 55 or 60 people should go and include civil societies, women, government, and different group of politicals from different people from the different group of the political groups. So they should also get together, and they should be very well prepared, that what they should say in the conference, and what they should, how they should represent Afghanistan.
Absolutely. So, Tanya, what do you think? They've given the word, they'll get back to the table, perhaps the list will get shortened, and we'll be back on track. Is that your sense also?
Well, I think if anything we need to highlight is the importance of these intra-Afghan talks. Every voice has to be heard. I mean, we can focus on excessively on the numbers, or we can look at the effort that was put in compiling this comprehensive list to produce a broad-based delegation where most voices were going to be heard. And this is important. These talks are determining the fate of the country. It's very important for every voice to be heard, whether it's, as you pointed out, the minorities and women, but also the tribes, different parts of Afghanistan, different ideologies. Everybody really needs to be heard. And it's unfortunate that this round of talks had to be postponed, but we remain hopeful that everybody in Afghanistan wants peace.
Okay.
So,
thank you so much, Tanya Goudsouzian, Zakia Wardak, Rahimullah Yusufzai. The consensus seems to be that talks will happen. It's just a hiccup in the sense that obviously the Taliban are also playing hardball. And they want to sort of, make their presence felt, not just in relation to the official dialogue that they're having with the United States, but also the Intra-Afghan dialogue. But the consensus, the analysts, is that they will come round to sitting vis-a-vis from any Afghan delegation if the number can be rationalized. We'll take a short break, and at the other end of the break, discuss the very low voter turnout in Indian-occupied Kashmir, where polling took place yesterday for 2 Lok Sabha seats in the second phase of India's election. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. India began voting on April 11th in a 7-phase polling exercise to vote in the next government. Casting the ballot is considered a baseline for democratic expression and determines an orderly transition from one set of people's representatives to another. But it is just that, the baseline. It does not, in and of itself, mean that a country is democratic in the sense of being liberal and inclusive. The Indian elections have always been an exercise in majoritarian consensus. Since the coming to power of Prime Minister Narendra Modi in 2014, that majoritarian consensus has become violent, repressive, and coercive, excluding non-Hindu minority groups, including Muslims, who form the largest minority in India. There's an overall problem, but the microcosm of everything that is wrong about India's democracy is the disputed state of Jammu and Kashmir. Since 2014, the occupied state has seen a rising levels of state violence and the fight back by the occupied population. Yesterday, the voter turnout in Srinagar was 14% and 7% in the city. What exactly do elections mean for an occupied population? To discuss this, we have with us Muzzamil Ayub, a Kashmiri activist based in London, and Gowhar Geelani, who's a journalist and joins me from Srinagar. Gowhar Geelani, since you were on the ground, tell us what happened yesterday. There was, of course, I have a list which tells me that towards south on the Jammu side, the turnout was obviously much more, but in the north, in the valley, it was low.
Well, Mr. Ejaz Haider, in Srinagar parliamentary constituency, which basically comprises 3 districts, that is the summer capital Srinagar and central Kashmir's district of Budgam, and also Ganderbal, which basically has 15 assembly segments. And in those areas, the lowest turnout was witnessed in the summer capital Srinagar, which was 7.69. And overall in all these 3 districts, the turnout was below 15%. And this despite the fact that all the Hurriyat leadership is either behind the bars or placed under house arrest or facing NIA summons. And the banning of 2 organizations, Jamaat Islami, and arrest of its over 400 sympathizers and members. And also, the kind of crackdown and militarization that is in Kashmir. And despite that, this militaristic and muscular policy, the turnout has been 7.67% in Srinagar, which is again a stark reminder how bad things are in Kashmir and how, Mr. Narendra Modi's policies, the muscular policy has actually failed on the ground. And people, I traveled to central Kashmir yesterday, and also I was in Srinagar. There are 90 polling booths in this Srinagar Budgam parliamentary constituency, where 0%, not a single vote was cast. And I traveled to the downtown of Srinagar yesterday around afternoon, around Zohar prayers, and there was like 2 polling stations where only 1 vote had been cast at 7:29 a.m. And then I traveled to, Budgam, which is a Shia-dominated region. There too, the polling percentage did not go beyond 20%. And it is normally considered to be a stronghold of one particular party. So there has been, the boycott call. Even the Hurriyat and the JKLF did not get a level playing field to reach out to the masses with their boycott campaign. But the people themselves chose to boycott the elections, and this has been a massive victory for the sentiment on the ground, for resolution, and a massive failure for the Modi's muscular and militaristic policy in Kashmir.
Absolutely. By the way, it's lovely to hear the azan in the background, since it's an occupied territory, and we know what happens with the Muslims there. Nonetheless, it was great to hear the azan. Muzzamil, I want to just go to the conceptual part of it, to which I sort of indicated in my introduction about democracy and the electoral exercise as just a baseline, which in and of itself does not mean that a state or a country is also democratic in the sense of being inclusive and liberal, where there is constitutionalism. I was talking yesterday to Professor Ashok Swain, who teaches in Sweden, and he said to me that if the BJP is returned to power, there are 2 possibilities. One is that they would try to change the nature of the constitution, because that is a hurdle, because at least in theory, it's a secular constitution. And then he said that were that to happen, there's a possibility of a pushback, and we could see, what he described as almost a state of civil war. The world looks at India as the most populous democracy, as the beacon of democracy in the developing world, where there have been other states that have not been able to bring in democracy and all of that. So this charade of democracy, how do you look at it? I mean, what's the narrative here?
I think ultimately we've seen that India's attempt at democracy is the only way they actually promote democracy is through the RSS and the BJP. That is their beacon. That is their representation of what democracy is in the rest of India. When it comes to Kashmir, I think in terms of voter turnout, let's switch the game a little bit. Let's change the narrative and talk about the number of the boycott numbers instead. I mean, it's fine that we say it's 2% and 7% came to the votes, but ultimately, when we look at the reverse, it's 93% of people boycotted the elections. That is in itself a referendum. 93% did not choose to go through the constitutional parameters of India or what they perceive are democratic values inside Kashmir. 93% on average have boycotted the polls. That referendum in itself means that we reject the Indian constitution. We reject the Indian narrative. We reject the BJP. Most importantly, we reject Narendra Modi. When it comes to internationalization of what India is, especially in its democratic values, I think we've seen, especially in the last couple of months, with the illegal airstrike they committed in Pakistan and the gamesmanship, the captaincy of Imran Khan when he returned the Air Force pilot. That is democratic values. If anybody is a beacon of hope in the subcontinent at the moment, it has to be Pakistan. India cannot be considered a beacon of hope. It cannot be considered a rising or shining power of democratic values in the subcontinent, especially when you see the beef, the repercussions of people eating beef or even transporting beef, or even the shak, the theory that somebody might be eating beef, that they lynch them, being considered a rape capital. And I think it's about time that the world remembers and they consider that India is not some kind of nostalgic tourism destination. It is the hub of radical right-wing, mercilessly killing the minorities, not just in Kashmir, but also the rest of India.
Absolutely. Muzzamil, but here's the thing. While since 2014, this has become very overt, and there's also no pretense now. But even under the Congress governments, there's been a lot of talk about secularism and the rest of it. But when it came to occupied Kashmir, the essence deep down has always been the same. It's been a thin veneer. You scratch it, and down below, you find the same kind of Hindu Rashtra, real estate, the civilizing project of secularism, of liberalism, and this is the liberalism which ultimately, in trying to, it's that old Kipling thing, the savage wars of peace kind of a thing, where the civilizing influence is going to the uncouth brutes of Kashmir need to be civilized and molded according to the secular Indian constitution. So I think when we look at the narrative, we also have to perhaps understand, as I do being a Kashmiri, and I declare it very openly, the fact is that the Congress hasn't really been, it has been more subtle, but it has been the same.
Absolutely. There is no real difference when it comes to Kashmir. Within India, they may preach different morals and different values, but ultimately, when it comes to core issues, for example, the caste system, for example, the so-called integrity of India in respect to Kashmir, the Congress and the BJP are exactly the same. It doesn't matter which power, which organization, which government is formed, the core policy on Kashmir will never ever change. As they say, a leopard never changes its spots, and the Prime Ministership of India is never going to change, regardless of who the party is, regardless of whether it's going to be Congress or BJP or even Aam Aadmi Party. We have Kejriwal, who is in Delhi, who is supported by the young working class, the slightly leftist. But even those people still have the same policy on Kashmir, that these people need to be de-radicalized, as if the Kashmir has a tendency to be radical, overtly against India, unnecessarily, as if it is some kind of ingrained, I don't want to use the word, but brainwashing, as if Pakistan is somehow on the ground brainwashing the people of Kashmir. Pakistan are thousands of miles away. It is the Indian army that is inside Kashmir, in the villages, in the towns, raping civilians, killing people mercilessly, using bullets and pellets, and they call us uncivilized. I'm glad that you used the term from Rudyard Kipling about the savages. I mean, when we talk about savages, can we remember just for a moment that we have nearly 1 million military personnel inside Kashmir, occupying territories, occupying people's homes, occupying the hospitals even. The polling booths are not democratic the way that they're run. You have military personnel, people are voting on gunpoint. Not that I approve of the system of governance inside Kashmir anyway, but even then, if people want to vote, then it has to be under the barrel of the gun. Civilization as it is completely devoid in India, but when it translates to Kashmir, the way that they have portrayed us in the rest of the world is nonsensical. But the most important thing that I think is that the so-called liberals and the academics that claim to be sympathizers of Kashmir, within a particular framework, they are happy to talk about Kashmir. But beyond that, it is non-existent. I want to give you a quick example of Barkat Dutt. Just a couple of days ago, she was infamous for being a so-called champion of Kashmir. She will talk about women's rights, but she will not talk about the rapes that were caused or committed by the Indian army. She won't talk about the human shields. She won't talk about the illegal laws, the draconian laws, or for that matter, the Geneva Convention. There's something that she mentioned on her Twitter when the Indian Air Force pilot was captured. But when it comes to Kashmir, no, we have to stay within the policy of the Indian government. Kashmir is an integral part. Nonsense.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you, Gowhar Geelani, Muzzamil Thakur. This was about India's democracy, the illiberal democracy that is grounded in, as I said, not just majoritarian consensus, but majoritarian coercion, especially in relation to the minorities, and specifically in relation to the largest minority, which is the Indian Muslims on the one hand in Indian mainland, and the Kashmiris who are not Indian Muslims because they live in a disputed state. This is all for this week from Indus Special. We shall see you next week. Until then, it's goodbye.